Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of his warship and looked at the screen in front of him. The numbers were there and they were real, but his mind did not want to believe them. 3 million people were dead, all of them gone in one day. New Harmony had been a beautiful colony where families lived and worked together. They had farms and schools and hospitals. Children played in the streets and people dreamed of a better future. Now there was nothing left except dust and broken dreams. The planet was burned from space and every living thing on it was killed. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan walked up to the Admiral with a data pad in her hands. Her eyes were red from crying and her voice shook when she spoke. She told him that the drones had checked the whole planet and found no survivors at all. The enemy had used plasma weapons that burned everything. The ground was melted glass now and nothing could live there anymore. Kate had family on New Harmony and they were all gone now. Her sister and her 2 young children had lived in the main city. They were planning to visit Earth next month, but now that would never happen. Morrison felt his hands shake with anger. The Zinthari Empire had been making threats for many months now. They said that humans were taking too much space in the galaxy. They claimed that New Harmony was in their territory, even though humans had been there for 10 years. Earth sent diplomats to talk with them. The diplomats offered to share the system or move some colonies. They tried everything to keep the peace, but the Zinthari did not want peace. They wanted humans to fear them and obey them without question. The Admiral told Kate to send all the information to Earth Command. He wanted them to see everything that happened here. Every single detail had to be recorded and sent. The people on Earth needed to know what the Zinthari had done. They needed to understand that this was not a military battle. This was murder of innocent people who could not fight back. The colony had no weapons and no soldiers. It was just families trying to build a new life under alien stars. Commander Ryan Blake came and stood next to Morrison. He was a good officer who had served for 20 years. He had seen many battles and many terrible things in his career. But even he looked shocked by what had happened here. Ryan asked the Admiral what he thought Earth would do now. Would they negotiate more, or would they finally fight back against this threat? Morrison looked at the tactical display that showed the enemy ships leaving the system. The Zinthari fleet was moving away slowly like they had all the time in the world. They were not afraid of any response from humanity. Morrison told Ryan that he did not know what Earth Command would decide, but he knew what they should do. For 50 years, humanity had tried to be peaceful in space. They had followed rules and made treaties with alien races. They had shown restraint even when others were aggressive toward them. Humans believed that being civilized meant avoiding violence whenever possible. They thought that talking and compromising was always better than fighting. But the Zinthari had just proven that some enemies do not understand peaceful words. The bridge crew worked in heavy silence around them. Everyone had lost someone they knew on New Harmony. Some had lost family members while others had lost friends from school or military training. The colony had been a popular place for people to move to because it was beautiful and peaceful. The planet had blue oceans and green forests. The weather was mild and perfect for growing food. Many retired soldiers had gone there to live out their final years in peace. Now all of those dreams were burned away. Morrison walked to the window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there was Earth, where he had been born 52 years ago. He remembered his childhood in Colorado, where the mountains touched the sky. He remembered learning about human history in school. The teacher had told them about the terrible wars that humans fought against each other. Millions had died in conflicts over land and resources and ideas. But humanity had learned from those mistakes. They had built a peaceful society where people worked together instead of fighting. When humans went to the stars, they promised to be better than their ancestors. But now Morrison wondered if that promise had been a mistake. Maybe the universe did not care about peaceful intentions. Maybe the galaxy was a dangerous place where only the strong survived. The Zinthari clearly believed that might made right. They had superior numbers and better weapons, and they used them without mercy. They saw human kindness as weakness to be exploited. They thought that peaceful species could be pushed around and threatened and destroyed. Kate came back with a message from Earth. Morrison read it quickly and felt his heart sink. The government was calling for an emergency meeting of all the leaders. They wanted to discuss the situation and decide on a response. That would take days or maybe weeks. Meanwhile, the Zinthari would prepare for whatever came next. They would strengthen their defenses and move their fleets into position. Every day that Earth waited was a day the enemy got stronger. Ryan asked if they should pursue the enemy fleet. The Zinthari ships were still in scanning range and could be caught if they moved quickly. Morrison wanted to say yes more than anything. He wanted to chase them down and make them pay for what they had done. But he was a military officer and he followed orders. He could not start a war on his own authority no matter how much he wanted revenge. So Morrison ordered the fleet to hold position and wait. They would stay here and document everything. They would recover whatever data they could from the planet's surface. They would be witnesses to this crime so that no one could deny what had happened. The Admiral knew that this evidence would be important. Some people on Earth would want to negotiate and find a peaceful solution. They would say that war was too dangerous and too costly. They would argue that humanity should find another way. But Morrison hoped that when the leaders saw the images from New Harmony, they would understand. This was not something that could be solved with talks and treaties. The Zinthari had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They had killed 3 million innocent people just to send a message. They wanted humans to be afraid and to give up their colonies and to accept being second-class citizens in the galaxy. And if humanity accepted that, then more attacks would come. More colonies would be destroyed. More families would die. Kate brought him a cup of coffee and stood beside him at the window. She did not say anything because there was nothing to say. They both knew that everything had changed in the last 24 hours. The universe that they knew was gone. Humanity could no longer pretend that being peaceful would keep them safe. They could no longer believe that other species would respect their rights. The Zinthari had taught them a harsh lesson about the reality of life among the stars. 3 days passed slowly. While they waited for orders from Earth, the crew went about their duties, but the mood was dark and angry. People talked in whispers about what should be done. Some wanted immediate revenge, while others worried about starting a war that humanity might lose. The Zinthari Empire was huge with dozens of planets and hundreds of warships. Humans had been in space for less than a century, and their fleet was small by comparison. A real war would be devastating for both sides. Finally, the message came through from Earth Command. Morrison read it 3 times to make sure he understood correctly. The government had made its decision, and it was not what anyone expected. President Marcus Webb was going to address the entire human population in a few hours. All ships were ordered to stand by for new instructions. The tone of the message was cold and formal. Morrison had served long enough to know what that meant. Something big was about to happen, and the galaxy was going to change forever. The United Earth Council chamber in Geneva was completely full of people. Every leader and military commander who could travel there had arrived for this moment. The gallery where citizens sat was packed and silent. Everyone knew that something important was about to happen. President Marcus Webb walked slowly to the speaking platform at the front of the chamber. He was 60 years old with gray hair and tired eyes. Webb had been elected 3 years ago because he promised peace and cooperation with alien species. He wanted humanity to expand through the galaxy by making friends instead of enemies. But the man who stood before the council now looked like he had aged 20 years in just a few days. Webb began his speech by talking about what happened at New Harmony. He described how 3 million people were killed without warning or reason. He explained that these were innocent civilians who posed no threat to anyone. They were farmers and teachers and doctors. They were children who would never grow up and parents who would never see their kids again. The Zinthari had given them no chance to surrender or evacuate. They simply burned the entire planet from orbit until nothing living remained. Webb's voice was steady, but his hands gripped the podium so hard that his knuckles turned white. The president said that for 50 years, humanity had chosen to be peaceful in space. They had made treaties with alien civilizations and followed the rules that everyone agreed on. When there were disputes, humans had always tried to talk and negotiate. They had given up territory and resources to avoid conflicts. They believed that showing restraint and kindness would earn respect from other species, but the Zinthari had proven that this approach had failed. Some enemies saw kindness as weakness and peace as cowardice. General Linda Hayes sat in the front row of the chamber wearing her full military uniform. She was the highest-ranking officer in the Earth Defense Force and had served for 35 years. Linda knew what was coming because she had spent the last 3 days in meetings with the president and other leaders. They had argued and debated and finally reached a decision that would change everything. She watched Webb carefully as he continued his speech. The general could see the weight of this moment pressing down on him. Webb told the council that the Zinthari Empire had made their position very clear through their actions. They viewed humanity as inferior and unworthy of respect. They saw human colonies as problems that could be eliminated whenever convenient. The Zinthari believed that they could commit genocide and face no real consequences. They thought that humans would be too afraid or too weak to respond with force. They had calculated that Earth would protest and condemn, but ultimately do nothing meaningful. Then the president said something that made everyone in the chamber hold their breath. He said that the Zinthari were wrong in their calculations. Completely and utterly wrong. Webb explained that humanity had kept certain weapons and technologies hidden away since the end of the resource wars. These were tools of destruction that humans had promised never to use again. They were kept in secret storage facilities and guarded carefully. Most people had forgotten they even existed, but Earth Command had always known that someday they might be needed again. Ambassador Lisa Grant sat in the diplomatic section and closed her eyes when she heard this. She was one of the strongest voices for peace in the government. Lisa had spent her entire career building relationships with alien species. She believed that violence only created more violence and that there was always a peaceful solution if people tried hard enough. But even she had to admit that the massacre at New Harmony changed everything. There was no negotiating with someone who would kill 3 million innocent people just to make a point. Webb continued speaking and his voice grew stronger and harder. He said that the Zinthari had awakened something terrible that they could not understand. They had reminded humanity of what it truly was beneath all the civilization and culture. Humans were not naturally peaceful creatures. They had fought wars against each other for thousands of years. They had developed weapons that could destroy entire continents. They had killed millions of their own kind over land and religion and resources. Earth was a planet that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times. The president explained that humans had chosen to be better than their ancestors. They had built a peaceful society and promised to never repeat the mistakes of the past. When they went to space, they carried those values with them, but being civilized did not mean being defenseless. Being peaceful did not mean being weak. Humanity had simply chosen to control their violent nature. Now the Zinthari had given them a reason to stop controlling it. Webb straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the cameras broadcasting this speech across all human worlds. He declared that as of this moment, the United Earth government was in a state of total war with the Zinthari Empire. There would be no more negotiations or peace talks. There would be no compromise or partial measures. The goal was complete and total victory. Humanity would not stop until the Zinthari understood the full consequences of their actions. The chamber erupted in noise as delegates stood and shouted. Some were cheering while others were protesting. Webb raised his hand and the room slowly fell silent again. He said that he understood this decision was controversial. Many people would argue that responding to violence with more violence was wrong. They would say that humanity should be better than that. But the president asked them to consider what being better actually meant. Did it mean allowing enemies to murder civilians without consequences? Did it mean showing weakness to those who only respected strength? General Hayes stood up from her seat and moved to stand beside the president. She had commanded fleets in combat before, and knew the cost of war. Linda had lost friends and colleagues in battles over the years. She had seen young soldiers die and had written letters to their families. War was never something to celebrate or take lightly, but sometimes war was necessary to protect everything that mattered. The Zinthari had forced this choice on humanity, and now they would learn what that choice meant. Webb continued his speech and explained what total war meant. Every resource that Earth possessed would be directed toward defeating the Zinthari. The military would be expanded massively with new ships and weapons. Technologies that had been banned would be brought back into service. Scientists would develop new methods of warfare. The economy would shift to support the war effort. Every human colony would contribute to this fight. This was not going to be a limited conflict or a police action. This was going to be a war of survival. The president said that he was not making this decision lightly. He had spent 3 days talking with advisors and military leaders. They had discussed every possible option. Some had suggested trying to negotiate with the Zinthari leadership. Others wanted to ask other alien species to help mediate. But in the end, there was only one real choice. Humanity had to show the galaxy that genocide would not be tolerated. They had to prove that peaceful species could defend themselves when necessary. Webb looked out at the packed chamber and spoke his final words. He told every human citizen, both military and civilian, that they had tried their best to be civilized. They had attempted diplomacy and negotiation. They had worked hard to be better than their violent ancestors. But the Zinthari had shown them that civilization meant nothing to enemies who only understood force. Being civilized in a universe full of predators just made you prey. Sometimes the only way to preserve peace was to be willing to fight for it. Then he said the words that would be remembered forever. Now we stop being civilized. The phrase echoed through the chamber and across every human world. It was broadcast to the colonies and transmitted through space. Everyone heard it and everyone understood what it meant. Humanity was done being the peaceful species that turned the other cheek. They were done accepting violence without responding. The Zinthari wanted to see what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. Now they were going to find out. After the speech ended, the council voted on the declaration of war. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed by a strong majority. Some delegates argued against it until the very end. They worried about the cost in lives and resources. They feared that humanity would lose its soul in the process of winning the war. But most understood that there was no other choice. The Zinthari had started this, and now humanity had to finish it. That night, General Hayes returned to Earth Defense Command and began issuing orders. Secret facilities across the solar system received authorization to begin operations. Weapons that had been locked away were being prepared for use. Scientists were pulled from civilian projects and assigned to military research. Shipyards started working around the clock to build new vessels. The entire human civilization was transforming from a peaceful society into a war machine. And deep in those secret facilities, something ancient and terrible was waking up from a long sleep. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in places that did not appear on any map, the awakening began. Dr. Helen Price stood in a control room watching massive steel doors open for the first time in 43 years. The doors were 10 meters thick and sealed with locks that required authorization from the president himself. Cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of metal and old machines. Helen felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was about to activate weapons that should never have been built in the first place. Her assistant, Greg Phillips, stood beside her, watching the screens that showed the vault interior. All the systems were coming online after decades of inactivity. The reactor cores were stable and the AI matrices were responding to commands. Everything was working perfectly, which was somehow more frightening than if something had been broken. Greg asked Helen if they were really going to do this. His voice was quiet and uncertain. He had read the history files and knew what these machines were capable of doing. Helen told him that they had no choice in the matter. The Zinthari Empire controlled 47 star systems and had 300 capital ships in their fleet. They had been building their military for centuries and knew how to fight wars. Humanity had only 20 colonies and a defense fleet that was designed for peacekeeping, not conquest. In a conventional war, the Zinthari would crush Earth forces through sheer numbers. The only way to survive was to bring back the nightmares from humanity's past. The first war machines rolled out of their storage bays 6 hours later. They looked almost alive in the way they moved. The Autonomous Combat Units, or ACUs, were created during the Resource Wars, when human soldiers alone could not match the scale of destruction needed. Each unit was 3 meters tall and shaped like a spider with 8 legs. They had weapons built into every part of their bodies. But the most dangerous thing about them was not their weapons. It was their minds. Every ACU was controlled by a quantum AI that could think and learn and adapt to any situation. They could analyze battles in milliseconds and develop new tactics on the fly. They could coordinate with thousands of other units to create strategies that no human general could match. During the Resource Wars, it had taken 3 international treaties and the threat of human extinction to finally shut them down. The ACUs had been too efficient and too ruthless. They won battles, but they also terrified the people they were supposed to protect. Now they were being activated again, and Helen wondered if this was a mistake. She watched as the first unit moved through the facility running diagnostic tests. Its movements were smooth and precise, like a predator hunting prey. The AI inside was already analyzing its surroundings and calculating combat scenarios. Helen had to remind herself that these machines were tools. They had no emotions or desires. They simply followed their programming, which was to destroy designated enemies. At the same time, in orbit around Mars, another transformation was happening. The civilian construction crews at the shipyards were being evacuated and replaced with military engineers. They brought with them blueprints that had been sealed in classified archives since the end of the Resource Wars. Chief Engineer Paul Davis oversaw the work at Shipyard 7. He had never expected to see these designs outside of restricted databases. Some weapons were supposed to stay buried in history. His second-in-command, Sarah Mitchell, came to him with a data pad showing the construction schedule. She asked if they were really building Titan-class dreadnoughts. Paul shook his head and told her it was worse than that. They were building Ragnarok-class extinction vessels. Sarah felt her blood turn cold when she heard that name. Everyone in the military knew about the Ragnarok project. It had been designed as a last resort weapon. If humanity was going to die, then the Ragnarok ships would make sure their enemies died with them. Each Ragnarok vessel was basically a mobile planet killer. The main weapon could crack through a planet's crust and trigger volcanic eruptions across the entire surface. The secondary batteries could vaporize battleships in single shots. They carried enough firepower to sterilize a solar system. Building them had been considered a crime against civilization. Using them was supposed to be unthinkable. But here they were constructing these monsters because the Zinthari had forced their hand. Sarah asked how many they were planning to build. Paul looked at the construction orders and said all of them. Every shipyard in human space was being retooled for military production. General Hayes wanted 50 Ragnarok vessels operational within 6 months. That timeline was barely possible even with every facility working at maximum capacity. It would require stripping resources from colonies and redirecting the entire economy toward war production. Meanwhile, across human-controlled space, the civilian population was responding to the declaration of war. Recruitment centers were overwhelmed with volunteers. Lines of people stretched for blocks in every major city. They were not joining because of propaganda or government pressure. They were joining because they had seen the images from New Harmony. They had watched the recordings of burned cities and melted landscapes. They understood that the Zinthari viewed humans as insects to be exterminated. Colonel Frank Jordan oversaw recruitment for the new Colonial Marines Division. He stood in front of the recruitment center in New York watching the crowds. There were young people fresh out of school and older citizens who had never served in the military. There were men and women from every background and profession. They all had the same look in their eyes. It was not excitement or patriotism. It was cold determination mixed with anger. Frank turned to his aide and said that people finally understood what humanity really was. They had spent 50 years trying to be civilized and peaceful. They had believed that showing kindness would earn them respect in the galaxy, but the Zinthari had taught them a harsh lesson. The universe did not reward kindness. It rewarded strength and the willingness to use that strength without hesitation. The aide asked what humans really were if not a civilized species. Frank looked at the volunteers standing in line and explained that humans were survivors first and foremost. They were a species that had crawled up from caves and survived ice ages. They had endured plagues that killed millions and wars that should have destroyed them completely. Every human alive was descended from people who refused to give up no matter how bad things got. He said that the Zinthari thought they could intimidate humanity with violence. They believed that killing 3 million people would make humans afraid and submissive, but they had made a critical mistake in their calculations. Violence was not something alien to humanity. It was something that humans understood on a deep primal level. They had been practicing violence for their entire history. The Zinthari were about to learn what real violence looked like. Training facilities across Earth and the colonies began operating 24 hours a day. The new recruits learned how to use weapons and tactics that had not been taught in decades. They studied methods of warfare that had been banned by international law. Instructors who had fought in the resource wars came out of retirement to share their knowledge. These were people who knew how to fight dirty and win at any cost. In research laboratories, scientists worked on projects that made them uncomfortable. They were developing biological weapons and chemical agents. They were designing bombs that could level cities and missiles that could destroy moons. Some of them had moral objections to this work. They argued that creating such weapons made humanity no better than the Zinthari, but others pointed out that having weapons was different from using them indiscriminately. The goal was to win the war, not to commit genocide. General Hayes coordinated all of these efforts from Earth Defense Command. She worked 18-hour days managing logistics and reviewing plans. Every decision crossed her desk, from ship designs to battle strategies. Linda knew that she was helping to create a war machine that would shock the galaxy. She also knew that if they failed, then humanity would be extinct within a few years. The Zinthari had made their intentions clear at New Harmony. 3 months after the declaration of war, The first new warships began leaving the shipyards. They were sleek and deadly-looking vessels covered in weapons. Admiral Morrison watched them launch from the bridge of his flagship. His ship had been renamed from the Valkyrie to the Retribution. The new name felt appropriate given what they were about to do. The fleet was gathering for the first major offensive against Zinthari territory. Morrison received daily reports about the preparations. The ACU swarms were ready for deployment. The Ragnarok vessels were finishing their final tests. The Colonial Marines had completed their training and were boarding transport ships. Everything was coming together faster than anyone had thought possible. Fear and anger were powerful motivators. The memory of new harmony pushed everyone to work harder and faster. The galaxy was about to witness something it had never seen before. Humanity had always been the peaceful newcomers who followed the rules and tried to get along with everyone. Now they were becoming something else entirely. They were becoming the thing that their ancestors had been, apex predators who knew how to hunt and kill efficiently. The Zinthari had awakened that ancient instinct, and now they would face the consequences of their Admiral Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution and looked at the fleet assembled around his flagship. 30 warships hung in the darkness of space waiting for his command. They had been refitted with weapons that made his stomach turn. These were not the tools of peacekeepers. These were instruments of total war designed to kill as efficiently as possible. The ships looked different now, with angular armor and weapon ports covering every surface. They looked hungry for battle. The fleet was positioned at the edge of the Kravik system, which was the nearest Zinthari military installation to human space. Intelligence reports indicated that 200 enemy ships were stationed here, along with orbital defense platforms and ground bases. Under normal conditions, attacking such a fortified position would be suicide. But these were not normal conditions, and Morrison was not planning a normal attack. Commander Ryan Blake reported that all ships were ready to begin the assault. The ACU swarm was in position, waiting to be released. The Erebus had signaled that its weapons were fully charged and ready to fire. The Erebus was the first Ragnarok-class vessel to be completed, and Morrison had seen what it could do during test runs. The ship's main weapon had destroyed an asteroid the size of a small moon in a single shot. Its secondary batteries could tear through battleship armor like paper. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan approached with a message from General Hayes back at Earth Command. The general wanted Morrison to make the Zinthari understand what they had brought upon themselves. Kate's voice was steady now, unlike during those first terrible days after New Harmony. She had channeled her grief into cold determination. Everyone in the fleet had done the same. They were not here for revenge, even though that was part of it. They were here to send a message to the galaxy. Morrison gave the order to launch the ACU swarm and begin the attack. 5,000 autonomous combat units surged forward like a wave of metal death. Each unit was small enough to avoid most targeting systems, but packed enough firepower to cripple a frigate. They moved in perfect coordination, sharing information through their quantum network. The swarm functioned as a single organism with thousands of bodies all working toward the same goal. The Zinthari picket ships at the edge of the system detected the swarm immediately. Alarms began sounding across their fleet as commanders scrambled to respond to this threat. But they had never encountered anything like the ACUs before. Their tactical databases had no information about how to fight against them. By the time they realized what was happening, the swarm was already among them, tearing through their defenses. The ACUs did not fight fair, and they did not follow any rules of engagement. They simply destroyed everything in their path with mechanical efficiency. A Zinthari destroyer tried to retreat, but a dozen units attached themselves to its hull. They burned through the armor in seconds and detonated the ship's reactor from inside. The destroyer exploded in a flash of light that could be seen across the system. More enemy ships moved to engage the swarm, but it was like trying to fight a cloud. The ACU split into smaller groups and attacked from multiple directions. They targeted weapon systems and engines first, leaving the ships helpless. Then they moved in for the kill. Within 30 minutes, the outer defense perimeter had been completely breached. The surviving Zinthari ships were retreating toward the orbital platforms, hoping the heavy weapons there could stop the swarm. Blake reported that the swarm had penetrated the defensive perimeter and the enemy was regrouping. Morrison ordered the Erebus to fire at will. The massive Ragnarok-class vessel rotated slowly, bringing its main weapon to bear on the largest orbital platform. The charging sequence took 30 seconds, and during that time, everyone on the bridge held their breath. When the weapon fired, it created a beam of pure energy visible even through the vacuum of space. The orbital platform simply ceased to exist. One moment it was there covered in weapons and shields. The next moment there was nothing except debris and expanding clouds of vaporized metal. The other platforms tried to adjust their positions, but the Erebus fired again, destroying a second target. Then a third. Each shot was devastating and absolute. The Zinthari had never encountered weapons with this kind of power. Kate reported that they were receiving a transmission from the Zinthari command station. The enemy was requesting negotiations and wanted to discuss terms of surrender. Morrison felt cold fury settle over him like ice. Now they wanted to talk. Now that they were losing, they suddenly believed in diplomacy. They had not offered any negotiations before burning New Harmony. They had not discussed terms before murdering 3 million civilians. Morrison told Kate to send a reply. Tell them that humanity does not negotiate with genocidal regimes. Tell them to remember what they did at New Harmony. Then he ordered the attack to continue. The human fleet moved forward, engaging the remaining Zinthari ships. The battle was not even close. The enemy vessels were designed for conventional warfare. They expected opponents to follow certain rules and tactics. The human forces followed no rules at all. The ACUs swarmed over enemy battleships like insects over a corpse. The Retribution and other human vessels used weapons that the Zinthari had no defenses against. New types of missiles that could phase through shields. Energy weapons that could cut through armor like butter. Within 2 hours, the Zinthari fleet in the system had been reduced to scattered wreckage. Some ships tried to flee, but the ACUs hunted them down relentlessly. Blake reported that all enemy vessels had been destroyed or disabled. Morrison ordered the bombardment of the surface installations to begin. The Erebus fired its main weapon at the military bases on the planet below. Explosions bloomed across the surface as the bases were reduced to craters. The human fleet maintained fire for another hour until nothing remained of the Zinthari military presence in the system. When the battle was over, Morrison looked at the tactical display showing the destruction they had caused. The Kravik system was now a graveyard filled with the wreckage of 200 ships and dozens of installations. He felt no satisfaction in the victory. There was only a grim determination to continue. This was just the beginning. The Zinthari Empire controlled dozens of systems, and they all had to be dealt with. Blake asked what their orders were now. Morrison told him they would move to the next system and do the same thing. Then they would move to the system after that. They would not stop until the Zinthari understood the full price of what they had done. Every military installation would be destroyed. Every fleet would be scattered. They would keep fighting until the enemy had no capability to threaten humanity ever again. News of the victory at Kravik spread rapidly across human space, but there were no celebrations or parades. People acknowledged the success with cold satisfaction. This was what had to be done. This was the price the Zinthari had to pay for their crimes. The images from the battle were broadcast across all human colonies. Everyone saw what happened when you forced humanity to remember its capacity for violence. The other alien species in the galaxy watched these events with growing alarm. They had always seen humans as the peaceful newcomers who avoided conflict. Now they were witnessing a transformation that terrified them. Humanity was revealing weapons and tactics that seemed impossible. The ACU swarms became the subject of fearful whispers. The Ragnarok vessels were tracked like natural disasters. When one of those ships approached a system, governments would begin emergency evacuations. Over the next 3 months, the human fleet moved through Zinthari space like a storm. System after system fell to their advance. The Zinthari tried everything to stop them. They gathered their fleets for major battles. They fortified their positions with every weapon they possessed. They even attempted to use weapons of mass destruction. Nothing worked. The human forces adapted to every tactic and countered every strategy. The Zinthari High Council tried to negotiate multiple times. They offered territory and resources. They promised to pay reparations. They even suggested joint government of disputed systems, but humanity rejected every offer. President Webb had made it clear that there would be no negotiations until the Zinthari were completely defeated. They had to learn that genocide carried consequences that could not be avoided through diplomatic maneuvering. By the 6th month of the war, the Zinthari Empire was collapsing. They had lost 12 star systems and suffered millions of casualties. Their once mighty fleet was reduced to scattered remnants fleeing before the human advance. The Zinthari military that had been built over centuries was being systematically destroyed. Their economy was in ruins from the constant warfare. Their government was fracturing as different factions blamed each other for the disaster. Morrison watched his fleet prepare for what might be the final assault on the Zinthari home system. Intelligence suggested that the enemy had gathered their remaining forces there for a last stand. It would be the largest battle of the war. He knew that many of his people would die in the attack. But he also knew that it had to be done. The Zinthari had to be defeated so completely that they would never threaten anyone again. But before the attack could begin, a message arrived from Earth. President Webb was calling for all military operations to halt immediately. The Zinthari had offered unconditional surrender, and the government was gone. 6 months had passed since the massacre at New Harmony, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Zinthari Empire that had once controlled nearly 50 star systems was now broken and desperate. Their fleets were destroyed and their military bases were ruins. Millions of their people had died in the fighting. The once proud empire was begging for mercy from the species they had tried to exterminate. President Marcus Webb stood before the United Earth Council once again, but this time the mood in the chamber was different. 6 months ago, everyone had been united in their anger and determination. Now there were divisions appearing. Some delegates wanted to continue the war until the Zinthari were completely destroyed. Others argued that the point had been made and further fighting would only waste human lives. The debate had been going on for days. Webb announced that the Zinthari High Council had sent another communication offering unconditional surrender. They would cede all contested territories to humanity. They would pay reparations for generations. They would dismantle their military and submit to monitoring. They would accept any terms that Earth demanded. The message was desperate and filled with language that acknowledged their defeat. The proud empire was willing to accept total humiliation to survive. The chamber erupted in discussion as delegates shouted their opinions. Some were calling for the complete destruction of the Zinthari civilization. They argued that any enemy capable of genocide should not be allowed to exist. Others were urging acceptance of the surrender. They pointed out that continued fighting would cost human lives for no strategic gain. The Zinthari were already defeated and unable to threaten anyone. General Linda Hayes rose from her seat and requested permission to address the council. Webb nodded and stepped aside, letting her take the podium. Linda had commanded the war effort for 6 months and had seen every battle report. She knew the true cost of what they had accomplished. She also understood what would happen if they continued down this path. Linda began by reminding everyone of why the war had started. 6 months ago, they had decided to stop being civilized and unleash weapons that should have stayed buried. They had fought with the same brutality that their ancestors once used against each other. The strategy had worked perfectly. The Zinthari Empire was shattered beyond repair. They would never again threaten humanity or any other species. The lesson had been taught in blood and fire. But then she asked the critical question that everyone was avoiding. What happens now? They had proven that humanity was not a species to be trifled with. They had shown the galaxy what humans were capable of when pushed to their limits. Every alien civilization had seen the reports and understood the message. But proving their strength was only half of the equation. Now they had to prove that they knew when to stop. A delegate stood up and shouted that the Zinthari had murdered 3 million people. How could humanity just accept their surrender and move on like nothing had happened? Linda looked at him with tired eyes and said that accepting surrender was not the same as forgiveness. The Zinthari would pay for their crimes through reparations and restrictions. But vengeance and justice were not the same thing. Continuing to kill when the enemy was already defeated would make humans no better than the Zinthari themselves. She explained that being civilized did not mean being weak. It meant knowing when to fight and when to stop fighting. The massacre at New Harmony had demanded a response, and humanity had given one. They had matched the Zinthari in violence and exceeded them in efficiency. But civilization also meant recognizing that unlimited violence only created more violence. There had to be a point where the fighting stopped or everyone would lose. Admiral Morrison appeared via holographic link from the bridge of the Retribution. He had spent 6 months watching his crews fight battle after battle. He had seen young soldiers become hardened killers. He had watched the humanity drain from their eyes with each victory. Morrison told the council that his people were tired and demoralized. They had done what was necessary, but the cost was higher than anyone had calculated. He said that every battle they won pushed them further from the peaceful society they had built. The weapons and tactics they were using changed people in ways that could not be undone. If they continued this war, they would destroy not just the Zinthari but themselves. They would become a civilization built on violence and fear. That was not the future that anyone wanted for humanity. President Webb stepped forward again and addressed the council directly. He said that they had a choice to make that would define humanity for generations. They could continue down the path of violence and become the very monsters they had fought against, or they could prove that their civilization was stronger than their capacity for destruction. They could show the galaxy that humans knew not just how to fight but when to stop fighting. He reminded them that they had stopped being civilized because they had to. The Zinthari had given them no choice, but now they had a choice again. They could choose to be civilized even though they had the power to destroy. That choice was what separated humanity from species like the Zinthari. Power without restraint was just barbarism. True civilization meant having power and choosing not to use it unnecessarily. The vote took place 2 hours later after more debate and discussion. The council voted to accept the Zinthari surrender by a narrow margin. Many delegates were unhappy with the decision. They felt that the enemy deserved total destruction for what they had done. But the majority understood that continuing the war would only harm humanity in the long run. The Zinthari would survive, but they would never again be a threat to anyone. The terms of surrender were harsh but not genocidal. The Zinthari would reduce their military to a small defense force. They would allow human observers to monitor their activities. They would pay reparations for the next 50 years. They would officially acknowledge their guilt in the massacre, but they would survive as a species and eventually find their own path forward. In the weeks that followed, humanity began the difficult process of putting the monsters back in their cages. The ACU swarms were deactivated and returned to storage. The Ragnarok-class vessels were mothballed and hidden away. The weapons and tactics that had proven so effective were sealed behind treaties and oaths. It was like trying to put a genie back in a bottle. Everyone knew the weapons existed now. Everyone knew what humanity was capable of doing. Dr. Helen Price oversaw the shutdown of the last ACU production facility. She watched as the machines powered down and returned to their long sleep. Her assistant Greg asked if she thought they would ever need to wake them again. Helen said she hoped not, but if they did, at least the galaxy would know better than to push humanity that far. The weapons would remain as a deterrent and a reminder. On Earth, a memorial was constructed for the victims of New Harmony. 3 million names were carved in stone, creating a wall that stretched for miles. The memorial stood as a reminder of the cost of complacency and the price of peace. Every year on the anniversary of the massacre, people would gather there to remember. They would read the names and tell the stories of those who were lost. President Webb attended the dedication ceremony and gave a speech that would be remembered for generations. He spoke about the delicate balance that humanity had learned to maintain between civilization and violence. He said that humans were capable of both great compassion and terrible destruction. The challenge was not to deny their capacity for violence, but to choose when and how to use it. He explained that they had tried to be peaceful, and when that failed, they had shown the galaxy what they were capable of. Now they had to prove that they were strong enough to be peaceful again. That was the true test of civilization. Anyone could destroy. It took real strength to build and protect without becoming a destroyer yourself. Across human space, life slowly returned to normal. The colonies rebuilt and expanded. Trade routes reopened and commerce resumed. Diplomatic relations with other species were carefully restored, though everyone was more cautious now. The galaxy had seen what happened when humanity stopped being civilized. That memory would not fade quickly, but something fundamental had changed in how other species viewed humanity. They treated Earth with a new kind of respect that was mixed with healthy fear. The peaceful newcomers who had seemed so harmless were revealed to be something far more dangerous. Every alien government updated their threat assessments. Humanity was now classified as a species that should never be provoked. The lesson spread across the stars. Never mistake human kindness for weakness. Never assume that peaceful species are easy targets. The most dangerous civilizations are not the ones that are always violent. They are the ones that choose peace but remember how to fight. They are the ones that have the power to destroy but the wisdom to restrain themselves. 10 years after the war, Admiral Morrison retired from active duty. He spent his remaining years teaching at the Earth Military Academy, where his lectures became legendary. Young cadets would ask him about the war and the decisions that were made. They wanted to understand how humanity had walked the line between civilization and barbarism. One day a cadet asked him if it had been worth it. Was all the violence and destruction justified by the outcome? Morrison was silent for a